Well, last week we left Joseph in a dungeon. Just to remind you how he got there, having been sold by his jealous brothers as a slave. He'd been sold into Egypt, where he was bought by Potiphar, the captain of Pharaoh's guard, and he was a slave in Potiphar's household until Potiphar saw good in him and gave him a lot of responsibility in his household. And then we had last time that story, didn't we, of how Potiphar's wife tried to seduce Joseph and how that he resisted and fled. And then she turned against him. She told lies about him, tried to make out that he tried to molest her. And as a result, Potiphar was angry and threw Joseph into prison. I wonder how Joseph felt languishing there in that prison. How would you feel? He'd done the right thing. He'd honored God. But now it seemed that God had abandoned him. It seemed so unfair. And he might have been tempted to just give up and say, Lord, I've tried to follow you. I've tried to be faithful. I've tried to be obedient to you, and this is what has happened. I don't think I'll try to follow you anymore. I'm just going to give up. I wonder how we cope with unjust suffering. You know, many years later, Peter wrote these words to slaves, and he said, how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it? But if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God. To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. And again, pointing to Christ, the writer to the Hebrews says, consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. And I have a feeling that Joseph, although those words were written many centuries later, I think he already understood those truths. And I believe that Joseph patiently endured that suffering there in the dungeon. And God hadn't abandoned him, had he? If you just go back to chapter 39 and verse 21, we read this: the Lord was with him. While Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. And if you go through dark times in your life, as most of us do at one time or another, never be tempted to think that God has abandoned you. Whatever circumstances we might be going through, God is still with you. And God is still good. And God still wants the best for you. Just remind ourselves again of that key verse that we keep coming back to, Romans 8, verse 28. We know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him. The things themselves that we're going through may not seem good, but God is still working through them for our good. Well, when we get to verse 21 of chapter 39, things start to get a little bit brighter for Joseph. The warder becomes favorable to him. Now, I can imagine that Joseph was probably, because of his attitude, an exemplary prisoner. He probably was uncomplaining, and maybe the warder was impressed by his uncomplaining attitude. And we might be, at first reading, we might think, well, because of the way that Joseph behaved, the warder showed favor to him. Well, to some extent that may be true, but was this really the reason for the warden's favorable attitude? Well, not according to the text. If we read again in verse 21, the Lord was with him, he showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warder. The Lord was behind this. It was because of the Lord that the warder granted Joseph favor. So was it because God saw in Joseph this steadfast and uncomplaining attitude that God rewarded him by making the warder favorable to him? Well, we have to be careful when we start to think like that, because we only have to go back a few verses, don't we? And we find Joseph in response to the advances of Potiphar's wife, we find Joseph behaving with impeccable morality, doing what was right in God's sight, refusing the advances of Potiphar's wife. And did God reward him for that admirable behavior? Well, it seems not, because he ended up in the dungeon. And so we can only conclude that that Joseph received favor from the warder because this was God's sovereign will for him, just as it was God's sovereign will to put him in the dungeon. The stark truth is that neither we nor even Joseph, with all his credentials and all his lovely character, the stark truth is that none of us deserve God's favor. We're all sinners. We're all under his judgment. None of us deserve his favor. If we do receive God's favor, it is only because of his sovereign will and his matchless grace, not as a reward for our behavior. We should never seek reward. F.B. Meyer says this. He says, do right because it is right to do right. Let me just say that again. Do right because it is right to do right. Not to seek reward. We just leave the consequences to God. And in all circumstances, good or bad, Joseph just needed to trust that God was still in control, still working out his perfect will. And that must be our attitude too. Well, as a result of the favor that the warder showed to Joseph, he was given some responsibility in the prison. He was put in charge of the other prisoners. And I imagine that that meant that he had a little bit more freedom. He was probably rather being confined to his own cell. He was able to move from cell to cell, checking up on the other prisoners. And one day into the prison come two prisoners. They're both officials of Pharaoh the king, his cupbearer and his baker. They both offended the king in some way, and in his anger, he'd throw them into the prison. And one morning, while Joseph was doing his rounds, checking on all the prisoners, he comes into the cell where these two officials, the cupbearer and the baker, are in the prison there. And he notices that they are dejected, and he asks them why they're dejected. And he learns from them that that night they had both had dreams, and they are dejected because they don't know what the dreams mean. Let's pick up the story. If you've got your Bible open, you might like to turn to chapter 40. Let's pick it up halfway through verse 8. Then Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams. So the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream. He said to him, in my dream I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand. This is what it means, Joseph said to him. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon. When the chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favorable interpretation, he said to Joseph, I too had a dream. On my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head. This is what it means, Joseph said. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale your body on a pole, and the birds will eat away your flesh. Very briefly, 3 very quick lessons to learn from these dreams. The first is that Joseph noticed that they were dejected and he wanted to help them. Don't forget that Joseph himself was still a prisoner. Yes, he may have had a bit more freedom now, but he was still in this horrible Egyptian dungeon, a very horrible place to be. Dearly, he wanted to get out of that horrible place. You can tell that the way he asked the cupbearer to put in a word for him when the cupbearer gets out to Pharaoh. He could have been so consumed by his own difficulties, his own troubles, his own feelings, that he became unaware of the distress of others. But no, he sees their dejection. Not only sees, but he asks them why. He wants to know why they're feeling so sad. And that's a lesson for us, isn't it? Do we sometimes get so wrapped up in our own problems that we forget, we don't take note of the problems of others? We don't really take a full interest. We might ask very casually, but do we really take an interest in the problems that others are experiencing? And then secondly, Joseph gives God the glory for his gift. You know, dreams seem to play a big part in the story of Joseph. We've already seen, haven't we, how that he himself had meaningful dreams when he was a teenager. And dreams will play a big part later on in the story, as we shall see as this unfolds. It seems to me, as I read the Bible, that throughout history, God reveals himself in different ways at different times. We don't find miracles on every page of the Bible, but there seems to be a cluster of miracles around the time of Elijah and Elisha, and God seems to use that particular time and that particular means to reveal more of himself. Angels, again, we find clusters where angelic appearances seem more common than at other times. Around the birth of Jesus, there are many times when angels intervened in people's lives, and God spoke through angels. During the time of the exile, God used prophets, raised up prophets to speak to his people. And of course, in our own day, we have the completed word of God, don't we? And that seems to be the main way that God speaks to us today. Not to say that God cannot speak in these other ways, but at different times, he seems to use different ways. Now, as far as we know, Joseph, we know he didn't have a complete Bible. And as far as we know, he never performed a miracle. As far as we know, he never saw an angel. But it seems that at this time in his life and in this period of Israel's history, that God uses dreams to reveal his purposes. And God had given Joseph the ability to interpret dreams. I don't know whether Joseph knew that he had that ability. I suspect that it just came to him at this particular time as he heard about these dreams. He just trusted that God would somehow enable him to know what they meant. But the important thing is that Joseph never drew attention to himself. What does he say in verse 8? Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams. He wanted all the glory to go to God. It wasn't him that was being so clever about this. He just wanted to glorify God and acknowledge that this gift was from God. And whatever gifts God may have given us, we are to use them for his glory and for the edification of others, not for drawing attention to ourselves, not to uplift ourselves, but purely for God's glory. And then thirdly, Joseph was faithful to the truth. You know, when you think about it, neither of these messages was particularly easy to give. Although he was able to give the cupbearer good news, just think about it. He was putting himself on the line here. If it hadn't come true, what he said, and after 3 days, the cupbearer was still languishing there in prison, Joseph would have had a really tough time of it. But it might have been tempting for Joseph to say, well, yes, your dream means that Pharaoh's going to restore you to your former position. But he might have just sort of left out the 3-day bit and give himself a bit of wriggle room. But no, Joseph was faithful to what God had revealed to him, and he told the cupbearer what was going to happen. And then, of course, the message to the baker, that was a difficult message to give, wasn't it? That the baker was going to be executed, a very difficult message. But again, Joseph didn't shrink from it. He was faithful to what God had revealed to him, and he told the baker very clearly what was going to happen. He told the truth. And we too must be people who are honest. Sometimes it's not always easy to be absolutely truthful, but we are to be truthful and honest in all of our dealings. Well, what Joseph said did come to pass. After 3 days, it was Pharaoh's birthday, and sure enough, the cupbearer was restored to his former position, and the baker sadly was taken away, executed, and his body hung on a pole. And the chapter 40 ends very sadly. The last verse, the chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. But although the cupbearer forgot Joseph, God hadn't forgotten him. And we shall learn more about that next week. May God bless you all.